Hello. Today I'm diving into a very cool topic in physiology, resting membrane potentials and action potentials. So I'm just going to break it down step by step, draw some diagrams, and wrap up with some ideas like the Nernst equations, graded potentials, and how myelin changes things. So part 1 here we have the resting membrane potential. So here we have a simple cell with potassium and sodium ions. So intracellular, here we have the potassium, and then extracellular we have the sodium. So what is resting membrane potential? Resting membrane potential is voltage across a membrane when a neuron is at rest. So usually negative 70 millivolts in most neurons. And so this means that the inside of the cell is more negative than the outside. What causes this? Resting membrane potential is caused by three main things, and that would be the sodium-potassium pump, the potassium leak channels, and selective permeability. Okay, so the sodium-potassium pump helps establish the gradient. So it pumps 3 sodiums out of the cell, or into the cell, and 2 potassiums out of the cell. This makes the inside more negative by causing a separation of charge. But this doesn't contribute to the majority of the negative charge in here. What contributes to the majority of this is the potassium leak channels. So due to the concentration gradient, as you can see here, we have a big K. That means we have a lot of potassium in the cell. It really wants to leave. As the potassium leaves, it leaves behind negative charges here. So this gradient causes it to leave behind negative charges that causes the inside of the cell, or this is the main reason why the inside of the cell is more negative. And finally, with selective permeability, the membrane is more permeable to potassium than to sodium. This allows potassium's movement to dominate. What affects the resting membrane potential's magnitude? That is going to be ion concentration differences. So as I said, potassium there's a lot of it in the cell. It wants to leave and leave behind those negative charges. There's a lot of sodium outside the cell, and it wants to enter, but the membrane is not as permeable to potassium. So if you increase extracellular potassium, so if you had more potassium outside of the cell, it would make this gradient less strong. Less potassium would leave, so there'd be fewer negative charges in the cell, causing the resting membrane potential to become less negative or closer to 0. Furthermore, if the permeability of sodium increased, so if more sodium could get in, this would also move the resting membrane potential towards 0 more positively. Now the Nernst equation. The Nernst equation tells us what the equilibrium potential would be for one singular ion if it were the only one present. So it's based on ion concentration in the cell versus out of the cell. So for example, for potassium, the equilibrium potential is around negative 90 millivolts. That's where potassium would like the membrane to be. For sodium, it's about positive 60. So resting membrane potential ends up somewhere in between because the membrane is more permeable to potassium. Now we have driving force. Driving force is equal to the membrane potential minus the ion's equilibrium potential. So driving force just tells you where the ion is compared to where the ion wants to be. So like we showed here, there's a lot of potassium in the cell. It wants to be out of the cell, so it has a pretty small driving force at resting membrane potential because it already has that negative charge here. However, sodium, there's a lot of it outside of the cell. It's really attracted to this negative environment in here, so it has a strong driving force. It really wants to rush in. All right, moving on to part 2, we're going to talk about action potentials. So an action potential is what happens when threshold is reached. It's an all or nothing thing, and it travels down the axon. So here, and threshold is usually about negative. That's supposed to have a negative sign. It's usually about negative 55 millivolts. So once threshold reaches negative 55 once it reaches negative 55 millivolts, you reach threshold and you have an action potential. So here we see my little graph. So here at negative 70, we're resting. This is resting at memory potential. Once we have a stimulus here, it starts to shoot up. What happens here is you have a stimulus and it causes depolarization and voltage-gated sodium channels open. Just like what we said with the driving force up here, there's a lot of sodium outside the cell. It's attracted to this negative charge in here. With the gradient, it really wants to rush in. It's waiting for its moment. So as soon as a stimulus happens, that voltage-gated sodium channels open. Sodium rushes in, causing more negative charges in the cell, more positive charges in the cell, causing the voltage to become more positive. So this is what this slope is. It's becoming more positive. Once it hits threshold, right here, the voltage-gated channels open, and then we come and start to peak. Once we peak here, the sodium channels inactivate and the potassium channels open. So sodium inactivates, potassium opens, okay? And now we have the repolarization stage. So potassium exits the cell. This is causing more separation of charge again. The voltage is starting to pan back down. Now we have hyperpolarization. So the potassium channels stay open a bit too long. The cell becomes more negative than resting, and it needs to recalibrate to return to resting membrane potential. This causes the potassium channels to close and the sodium-potassium pumps to restore baseline. Now we have absolute refractory periods versus relative refractory periods. So when it's an absolute refractory period, you cannot have another membrane potential or action potential. So when you're here, you're still currently creating the first action potential, so you can't just start another one. It can't peak anymore. You see, so this is absolute refractory period. Relative refractory period is when we're starting to come back down. You can have another action potential where it shoots up again. This can happen, but it needs to be with a really strong stimulus. All right. Now we have graded potential versus action potential. So graded potentials vary in size, they fade over distance, and they're local. So a graded potential would look something like this. So let's say we have a stimulus, and it has a little spike, but it's not a stimulus that's strong enough to cause it to hit threshold and generate an action potential. This is called a graded potential. Whereas action potentials travel long distances, are all or none, and are when threshold is reached. Finally, we have capacitance and length constant. So capacitance is the number of separated charges per 70 volts. So as you see here, we have 4 separated charges for 70 volts. That's the capacitance of our little cell drawing here. The length constant is how far the voltage can travel before it drops off. So if you have a higher length constant, your signal is traveling farther. And this is affected by myelin. So here we have a myelinated cell versus here we have an unmyelinated. As you can see, with myelin, capacitance goes down. So you have less charge stored and faster signaling. Also, the length constant goes up, so signals go farther. So To wrap it up, resting potential is mainly due to potassium leak in the sodium-potassium pump. Action potentials are fast, all or none events driven by voltage-gated sodium and potassium channels, and myelin makes everything go faster by changing the electrical properties of the membrane. Thank you.